The night my family decided I no longer existed, I was still standing in my own kitchen. I remember that detail clearly, because the floor was cold through my socks, and the oven timer kept ticking like it didn't understand what had just been said. "We didn't think you'd mind," my daughter-in-law said, not looking at me. "It just made more sense this way." I stood there, holding a dish towel, watching my son stare at the countertop, like it might rescue him. Mind what exactly? That I'd been excluded from the company I helped build, that my name was missing from the new will, that decisions about my future had been made without me, or that they had waited until Christmas Eve in my house after I'd cooked for 8 hours to finally tell me. I am 61 years old. I have buried a husband, survived a breast cancer scare, and spent 3 decades balancing family loyalty with professional competence. I am not fragile, but in that moment, something inside me cracked so quietly, I almost missed it. "It's temporary," my son said. "You know how things are now. Investors want stability." Stability. That word again. The company was Halloway Interiors, a regional manufacturing firm specializing in custom cabinetry. My late husband and I had started it in our garage when our children were still in elementary school. I ran finance, payroll, compliance, contracts. For years, people assumed I was just the wife helping out, until the numbers proved otherwise. After my husband died, I stayed on, not because I needed the money, but because I believed in continuity, in legacy, in family. That belief would cost me everything. According to them, the board had voted. New leadership was needed, fresh vision. My son would step in fully. My daughter-in-law would oversee operations, and I apparently would fade into an advisory role that existed only on paper. "You'll still get distributions," she added quickly. "We're not monsters." I smiled. I even nodded, because women like me are trained to absorb shock silently. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later that night, after they left, when I found the envelope tucked into the mail slot. A copy of the revised will. Not mine, the company's. My husband's shares had been redistributed, trusts adjusted, my name removed as beneficiary, and replaced with language that described me as a dependent spouse. Dependent. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the house humming with old sounds, the refrigerator, the clock, the ghosts of conversations I thought meant something. I wasn't angry yet. I was humiliated, because betrayal doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it shows up neatly printed, signed by people who once called you Mom. By morning, I understood something essential. They hadn't pushed me out because I was weak. They pushed me out because I was inconvenient. And inconvenience, I would soon learn, is the most dangerous thing a woman my age can become. People assume betrayal is loud, that it comes with shouting or slammed doors or dramatic ultimatums. Mine arrived quietly, wrapped in professionalism and fake concern. Over the next few weeks, I was slowly erased. Meeting invites stopped coming. Emails went unanswered. My office key stopped working. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law smiled with practiced sympathy. "Oh, the system's been updated. We assumed you wouldn't need access anymore." Assumed. I spent 35 years teaching myself not to overreact, to choose diplomacy over ego, to let younger voices feel powerful while I worked behind the scenes. That habit nearly destroyed me. The first real wound came at a board luncheon in January. I attended because my name was still technically listed as a director. Or so I thought. The receptionist didn't recognize me. "I'm sorry," she said politely. "Are you here as a guest?" I sat through the meeting anyway, watching my son present numbers I knew better than he did. He stumbled over projections I had personally refined. When I gently corrected him, The room went silent. He didn't look at me. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "You embarrassed me," he said, voice low. "You can't do that anymore." "Do what?" "Know the truth." That night, I cried, for the first time since my husband's funeral. Not because I'd lost power, but because I'd lost identity. They weren't just excluding me from decisions. They were rewriting history. By March, the manipulation turned practical. They suggested I sell my house, mentioned retirement communities, asked if I'd considered simplifying my finances. My daughter-in-law offered to help manage my accounts so nothing slips through the cracks. I realized then that this wasn't about succession. It was about control. They needed me small, confused, dependent. That was when I stopped reacting and started observing. I noticed the inconsistencies in the books, the unexplained transfers, the rushed vendor contracts with inflated costs. I noticed how often my daughter-in-law dismissed compliance checks as unnecessary, how she encouraged my son to bypass approvals I had insisted on for decades. I noticed everything, and I started documenting quietly. Dates, amounts, conversations. Not for revenge, for clarity, because clarity is the enemy of manipulation. One afternoon, while reorganizing old files, I found something unexpected. A letter from my husband, dated just months before his death. He'd written it to our lawyer, expressing concern about succession, and explicitly stating his wish that I retain controlling interest if anything happened to him. The letter had never been filed. It had never been shown to me. It had been buried. I sat on the floor, holding that letter, and felt the shift inside me. The emotional wound was no longer raw grief. It was resolve. They believed I was finished. They believed my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. Because when a woman like me stops begging to be seen, she starts planning to be undeniable. And I had just found the first key they never expected me to have. The first time I realized they were afraid of me again was the day my daughter-in-law stopped smiling. It happened in April, during what was supposed to be a routine audit meeting. I had requested copies of financial statements under the pretense of personal tax planning. Nothing confrontational, nothing dramatic, just a polite email worded carefully, the way women learn to do when they don't want to be labeled difficult. She responded within minutes. "Of course," she wrote. "I'll have someone pull those." Someone, not her, not my son. An hour later, a junior accountant I barely recognized appeared at my house with a thumb drive and shaking hands. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept apologizing, saying he wasn't sure he was supposed to give this to me. That told me everything. I spent the next 3 days going through the files alone at my dining table, the same table where I once helped my son with his college applications, where my husband used to spread blueprints late into the night, where we had planned a future I had foolishly assumed included honesty. The numbers didn't scream fraud, they whispered it. Payments split just below approval thresholds. Consulting fees routed through shell companies. Inventory written off and repurchased through third parties. Nothing obvious, nothing that would alarm someone skimming. But I wasn't skimming. I had built this system. I knew where money was supposed to breathe and where it was supposed to stop. By the end of the week, my hands were steady, but my heart wasn't, because the pattern was clear. They weren't just incompetent, they were stealing. Not from me directly, from the company, from employees, from vendors who trusted our name. And they were doing it under the assumption that I was too old, too tired, too hurt to notice. That assumption became their undoing. I didn't confront them. Instead, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. A former compliance officer who owed me a favor after I helped her through a hostile takeover in the 90s. She listened quietly as I explained. Then she said something that sent a chill through me. "If this is accurate," she said, "they're not just mismanaging. They're setting themselves up to take the fall. The fall. It dawned on me then. They hadn't pushed me out to protect the company. They had pushed me out to protect themselves. I was the firewall, the conscience, the one who asked questions and slowed things down. Remove me, and the narrative becomes simple. Aging founder loses touch. New leadership takes over. Mistakes happen, and someone else carries the blame. That night, I opened a new notebook. Not for grief, for strategy, because injustice becomes something else the moment you understand it was planned. And now I knew exactly where this was heading. The confrontation didn't come when I expected it. It came quietly, disguised as concern on a Tuesday morning when my son showed up at my door with coffee and a nervous smile. "We're worried about you," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You've seemed distant." I watched him closely. The way his shoulders were tight, the way his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the stack of papers I hadn't yet put away. "I've been busy," I replied, with what he asked too quickly. That was the tell. He sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around his mug like it might ground him. "Claire thinks you might benefit from stepping back completely," he said. "For your own peace." Peace. Always peace, when what they meant was silence. "I already stepped back," I said evenly. "You made sure of that." He flinched. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about reality. You're not in the room anymore. The market's different. The board needs cohesion." "And I don't provide that," I said. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. Thinner than the others. Cleaner. A proposal. Voluntary resignation from the board. Transfer of remaining shares into a family trust administered by him. A monthly stipend in exchange for non-interference. Non-interference. I didn't touch the papers. I instead walked to the sink and rinsed my coffee cup slowly. The sound of water filled the space where his courage should have been. "Did you read your father's letter?" I asked. He froze. "What letter?" I turned and watched his face carefully as I described it. The date, the lawyer, the intent. His color drained. "Claire said there was nothing else," he whispered. "Of course she did." I sat back down. "Tell me the truth," I said. "When were you planning to blame me?" He swallowed hard. "When the auditors came," he admitted. "If they came." There it was. The moment I knew my son had crossed a line he would never fully return from. "You were going to let them believe I'd lost control," I said quietly, "that I caused it." He looked down. "I thought it would be easier," he said. "For everyone." I laughed then. Not loudly, not cruelly. "Just once. There's nothing easy about betrayal," I said. "There's only delay." He stood abruptly. "You don't understand what's at stake," he snapped. "You could ruin us." I met his eyes. "You already did," I replied. "You just haven't felt it yet." He left without another word. That afternoon, I made my first official move. I forwarded the files to an independent forensic accountant, and as I pressed send, I felt something I hadn't felt since my husband died. Not grief, purpose, because once the truth is set in motion, it doesn't need permission to arrive. And when it does, it never knocks gently. By the time the forensic accountant called me back, I had already packed a small suitcase, not because I was running, because I was preparing for impact. Her voice was calm, professional, almost gentle. That scared me more than panic ever could. "You were right," she said. And then some. She didn't rush. She walked me through it slowly, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis that would permanently alter a family. Kickback patterns tied to a shell consulting firm. Inventory siphoned through a distributor owned by a friend of my daughter-in-law. Deferred liabilities hidden just long enough to close a refinancing deal. And then the sentence that landed like a blow to the chest. "They've structured it so the liability traces back to decisions made during your tenure." Of course they had. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had positioned me. If this collapsed, the story would be simple. Aging founder loses oversight. New leadership tries to clean up the mess. Tragic, but understandable. I thanked her and hung up my hands cold, despite the spring sun pouring through the windows. This was no longer about revenge. This was about survival. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, listening to the old house settle, remembering the sound of my husband's footsteps on these floors. He had trusted our son, trusted me to protect what we built. I had failed him once. I wouldn't fail again. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. Not the company lawyer, mine. A woman my age. Sharp, unimpressed by excuses. She listened without interrupting. Then she leaned back and said, "You have two options. You can expose this and risk being dragged through the mud. Or you can wait and let them collapse on their own." I thought of my son's face, the fear, the justification. "I don't want them destroyed," I said slowly. "I want the truth to land where it belongs." She nodded. "Then we control the timing." That afternoon, my daughter-in-law called me for the first time in weeks. Her voice was sweet again. Too sweet. "We should talk," she said. "There's been some confusion. I think we can fix this if we're honest with each other." I agreed to meet. We chose a cafe near the office. Neutral ground, public. She arrived perfectly put together, hair, immaculate smile, ready. "I miss how things used to be," she said, touching my hand as if we were allies again. "You know I respect you." I waited. She leaned in. "The auditors are asking questions. It would help if you clarified some things." From before, there it was. Not an apology, a request for cooperation. "I won't lie," I said. Her smile tightened. "No one's asking you to lie, just to simplify." "Simplify whose guilt?" I asked. Her eyes hardened. "You don't understand the consequences," she said. "If this goes public, the company could fail." I held her gaze. "Then you shouldn't have stolen from it." The air between us went cold. "You think you're untouchable," she said quietly. "But they'll believe us." "Not you." I stood. "They already are," I replied. "That's why this will hurt." As I walked out, my phone vibrated. A message from my lawyer. "It's time." The audit findings were scheduled to be presented to the board on a Friday morning in June. I was not invited. That detail mattered. Because exclusion only works when the excluded stay quiet. I arrived anyway. I walked into the conference room just as the lead auditor began speaking. My son's head snapped up. My daughter-in-law froze mid-sentence. No one asked me to leave. They were too stunned. The auditor continued, voice steady slides changing behind him. Numbers, dates, names, shell entities, unauthorized transfers, misrepresentation of inventory. Then my name appeared on the screen. Historical approvals, legacy controls. The implication hung heavy. I stood. "I need to clarify something," I said. Said calmly. Every eye turned toward me. These decisions were made after I was removed from operational authority. I continued. "I have documentation to prove that." I handed my lawyer the file. She distributed copies, emails, meeting minutes, access logs. The room shifted. My son looked sick. My daughter-in-law's jaw clenched. The auditor paused, reviewed the documents, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "This is significant." The board chair cleared his throat. "We'll need a recess." During that break, my son cornered me in the hallway. "You planned this," he whispered. "I prepared," I corrected. "You planned to sacrifice me." His eyes filled with something like regret. "I thought I could fix it," he said, "before it got this far." "You didn't want to fix it," I replied. "You wanted me to carry it." When the board reconvened, the tone had changed. The auditors recommended immediate suspension of executive authority, pending investigation. Both of them. My daughter-in-law stood abruptly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said sharply. "She's manipulating you." The board chair raised a hand. "We'll let the evidence speak." And it did. By the end of the day, my son was removed as interim CEO. My daughter-in-law was placed on administrative leave. The company's legal counsel initiated cooperation with regulators. As I walked out of the building, reporters were already gathering. I didn't stop. I didn't smile. I went home. That night, my son called. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," he said, voice breaking. "I know," I replied. "You meant for it to end with me." There was silence. Then he said, "What happens now?" I looked around my house. The walls, the history. "Now," I said, "you learn the cost of choosing convenience over conscience." And for the first time since this began, I felt the shift. The escalation was over. The fall had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no dramatic resignations broadcast on the evening news. Just emails marked confidential phones going unanswered, and the slow, unmistakable sound of a system correcting itself. Regulators arrived within days. They didn't look angry. They looked fretted. That was worse. Boredom meant they had seen this before, and they already knew how it usually ended. My son stopped calling. That silence hurt more than any accusation. I told myself it was necessary. That distance was part of the reckoning. Still, when I heard his voice in my head, I remembered him at 8 years old, sitting on the shop floor, counting screws into neat piles because he liked order. I wondered when order had turned into entitlement. The board reinstated me as interim financial authority within a week. Not out of sentiment, out of necessity. The company was bleeding credibility, and I was the only one left who understood both its numbers and its soul. Walking back into that office felt surreal. Same walls, same hum of machines, different eyes watching me now, some with relief, some with resentment. I didn't address the staff immediately. I waited. Power reasserts itself best when it doesn't beg for attention. Instead, I worked. I corrected books, froze questionable contracts, reinstated compliance protocols that had been quietly dismantled. Every action was documented, every decision justified, because I knew something they didn't yet understand. This wasn't over. Mid-July, my lawyer called me into her office. She closed the door behind me, a small but meaningful gesture. "They're cooperating," she said. "Both of them." I sat down slowly. "Cooperating how?" She slid a folder across the desk. Statements, emails, text messages. My daughter-in-law had flipped first. She blamed stress, pressure, fear of losing status. She admitted to rerouting funds, but claimed my son knew everything. My son's statement came next, shorter, less polished. He admitted he'd signed off on things he didn't fully understand, that he trusted her, that he assumed I'd catch problems if they got serious. He still thought I was the safety net. That realization stung more than the betrayal itself. "They're trying to negotiate reduced charges," my lawyer said, "in exchange for testimony." And I asked. She met my eyes. "They're willing to implicate each other." I closed the folder. Family drama doesn't end when the truth comes out. It just changes shape. "I won't intervene," I said. She nodded. "That's wise. But wisdom doesn't protect you from grief." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch. The cicadas were loud, insistent, living their brief lives without apology. I envied that. I thought about the inheritance, about the will they had altered, about how easily my role had been reduced to a liability. And then I felt something unexpected, relief, because if they were willing to destroy me to protect themselves, then the version of family I was mourning had never really existed. 2 days later, my daughter-in-law showed up unannounced. She looked smaller, not weaker, just diminished. "We need to talk," she said. I didn't invite her in. "I know you hate me," she continued. "I don't hate you," I replied. "I see you." She flinched. "You don't understand how hard it is," she said, "to build something and feel like it could vanish." I thought of all the years I'd held the company together, quietly, invisibly. I understand perfectly, I said. I just didn't steal to keep it. Her eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time. Please, she whispered. He won't survive prison. That was the moment she tried to make me choose. Mother or judge, mercy or justice. I looked at her and felt the final piece click into place. You already chose, I said. So did he. She stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked away. As she reached her car, I called after her. You should tell the truth, I said. It's the only thing left that might save you. She didn't turn around, and I knew then that whatever came next would not be gentle. The indictment came in August, thick with language that stripped away any illusion of misunderstanding. Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Seeing my son's name printed there felt unreal, like reading an obituary for a future that had died quietly. He called me that night, for the first time since the audit. Mom, he said, voice hollow, I'm scared. I closed my eyes, not because I didn't care, because I cared too much. You should be, I replied, but not for the reasons you think. Silence stretched between us. They offered me a deal, he said, if I testify. I know. Claire says you pushed her, he added, that this is all revenge. I let out a slow breath. This was never about revenge, I said. It was about truth. He laughed weakly. Truth doesn't feel very noble from here. No, I said. It feels expensive. He asked then quietly, the question he'd been circling since Christmas. Why didn't you just walk away? Because the truth matters. Because integrity isn't optional. Because letting them pin it on me would have been easier for everyone but me. I walked away from myself once I said, I won't do it again. The trial date was set for early fall. The company stabilized under interim leadership. Vendors returned. Employees relaxed. The crisis became something people whispered about instead of lived inside. I wasn't celebrated. I didn't want to be. I was tired. One afternoon, as I sorted through old files at home, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. My husband and me, standing in front of the garage where it all began. We were younger, proud, exhausted. We believed in building things that lasted. I held the photo and understood something at last. Legacy isn't what you pass down. It's what you refuse to let rot. In September, my daughter-in-law entered a plea agreement. She admitted everything. My son followed 2 weeks later. The courtroom was silent when the judge read the terms. Years reduced, fines imposed, restitution ordered. When my son looked at me, I didn't look away. I wanted him to remember that I was there, not as his shield, as his witness. Afterward, outside the courthouse, a reporter asked me if I felt vindicated. I shook my head. I feel finished, I said. That night, alone in my house, I packed away the last of the company files. I wasn't returning to the boardroom. That chapter was closed. What remained was something quieter, rebuilding myself without the weight of being useful to people who saw usefulness as weakness. As I turned off the light, my phone buzzed. A message from my lawyer. There's one more thing you should know. They're asking the court to reconsider the will changes. That was when I understood. They still thought this was about money, and the final lesson hadn't landed yet. They didn't ask to reconsider the will because they needed it. They asked because they believed they were still entitled to it. That realization settled into me slowly, like a bruise surfacing days after the impact. Even after indictments, after pleas, after public disgrace, they still believed my role in their lives was to absorb consequences so they wouldn't have to. My lawyer laid it out plainly. They're arguing undue influence, she said. They're claiming you altered your estate out of spite during emotional distress. I laughed, not because it was amusing, but because it was so painfully predictable. They want me declared irrational, I said. Again, she nodded. It's a common last move. A Hail Mary dressed up as concern. The hearing was scheduled for October, deliberately close to sentencing. They were hoping the emotional fog would work in their favor, that I'd look bitter, vindictive, unstable. What they didn't understand was that bitterness requires attachment. I no longer had that. In preparation, I did something unexpected. I invited a professional evaluator of my own choosing to assess me: financial competency, emotional stability, decision-making capacity. Not because I needed to prove myself, but because I wanted the record clean. We sat in my living room for hours. I answered questions honestly. I spoke about grief, about betrayal, about boundaries. When she asked why I changed the will, I didn't mention punishment. I wanted my assets aligned with my values, I said. And my values changed when the truth did. She nodded and kept writing. The day of the hearing, I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to my husband's funeral. Not for symbolism, because it fit, because it didn't pretend to be anything else. My son avoided my eyes in the courtroom. My daughter-in-law didn't. She stared at me with something like resentment mixed with desperation. Her attorney argued that my decisions were reactionary, that family conflict had clouded my judgment, that reconciliation was still possible if I'd just reconsider. When it was my turn to speak, the judge asked a single question: "Do you believe your family would have acted differently if you had complied?" I answered without hesitation. No. Silence followed. Then I added compliance would have delayed harm, not prevented it. The judge leaned back. "I see no evidence of incapacity," he said. "Nor do I see malice, only boundaries." Motion denied. The gavel came down softly. That sound didn't feel like victory. It felt like an ending. Outside the courthouse, my son approached me for the first time since his plea. "I don't expect anything," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know. I see it now." I looked at him, really looked. He was thinner, older. The arrogance gone, replaced by something quieter. "I hope you do," I said, "because seeing it is the beginning, not the repair." He nodded, tears brimming. I didn't hug him. Not because I couldn't, because he needed to feel the distance he'd created. That night, I went home and slept deeply. For the first time in months. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. But the story wasn't finished yet, because consequences don't end at courtrooms. They echo. The sentencing took place 2 weeks later. I didn't attend. That choice surprised everyone, including my lawyer. "Aren't you curious?" she asked. "I already know the outcome," I replied. "What I don't need is to relive it." Instead, I drove north, alone, to a small coastal town I'd visited once, years ago, with my husband. We'd talked then about retiring somewhere quiet, somewhere no one needed anything from us. We never made it. I checked into a modest inn and spent the morning walking along the water, listening to waves break without agenda. It was the first time since all of this began that I wasn't anticipating the next blow. That afternoon, my phone buzzed. Sentencing complete. My son received reduced time contingent on restitution and compliance. My daughter-in-law received a longer term, both barred permanently from corporate management. I closed the message and put the phone away. I sat on a bench overlooking the ocean and let the reality settle. They had paid, not because I demanded it, because the truth had nowhere else to go. When I returned home, the company was no longer mine in any meaningful way. I had resigned from the board, officially transferring my remaining interest to a charitable foundation focused on vocational training for women over 50. That decision felt right. I was done building structures that could be weaponized. I wanted to build something quieter. My son wrote to me from prison 3 weeks later. A handwritten letter, uneven, careful. He apologized. Not for the money, not for the company, for believing I would always catch him. That was the most honest thing he'd ever said.
I was
I told him I hoped he would learn to stand, without leaning on silence or privilege. I told him I loved him, but that love no longer meant rescue. I did not promise forgiveness. I promised honesty. As winter approached, my days became simpler. Morning walks, cooking for myself, reading without distraction. People sometimes mistake revenge for destruction. What I learned is that true revenge is subtraction. Removing yourself from roles that drain you. Removing access from those who misuse it. Removing guilt that was never yours to carry. I was no longer excluded. I had excluded myself from the lie. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more valuable than inheritance or control. I reclaimed authorship. There were still 2 chapters left in this story, not of conflict, but of rebirth. And for the first time, I was not afraid of what came next. Rebirth does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary days that no longer feel heavy. The first sign came in January, when I realized I had gone an entire week without checking my phone for messages that never came. No lawyers, no reporters, no late-night calls from people who only reached out when something was on fire. The silence felt earned. I sold the house in February, not because I had to, but because every room still carried echoes of who I had been required to be. The sale was clean, unremarkable, exactly how endings should be. I kept only what fit into a small moving truck. The rest I donated or gave away, including the china set my daughter-in-law once admired, while calculating what it might be worth. I moved into a smaller place, overlooking a public park. Children played there in the afternoons. Elderly couples walked hand in hand, arguing softly about birds and weather. No one knew my name. That anonymity felt like medicine. One afternoon, while unpacking books, I received a letter from the foundation that now held my former company shares. They wanted me to attend the opening of a training center for displaced women, many of them over 50, many of them quietly pushed aside by industries that preferred younger faces and cheaper loyalty. I almost declined. Old habits die slowly. Then I remembered how many times I had wished someone like me existed when I was first sidelined. I went. The room smelled like fresh paint and coffee. Folding chairs filled with women who looked tired but alert, the way people look when they are not ready to disappear. When they asked me to speak, my hands trembled just enough to remind me this mattered. I told them the truth. That experience does not expire. That loyalty is not weakness. That exclusion is often the first sign you are no longer controllable. I did not mention my son, or my daughter-in-law, or the courtroom. I spoke only about reclaiming authorship. Afterward, a woman with silver hair and steel eyes took my hand. "They tried to do that to me too," she said. "But I thought it was my fault." "It never is," I replied. That night, walking home through the park, I understood something I had been too busy surviving to see. My story had stopped being about revenge. It had become about translation, turning pain into clarity, turning betrayal into boundaries, turning loss into language other women could recognize. In March, I received one more letter. This one was from my son. He wrote about routine, about classes, about realizing how much had been handled for him without his noticing. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for money. He asked a question instead. How do you live without needing to be needed? I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I wrote back, you learn to need yourself first. I mailed it and felt no urge to say more, because growth does not require constant contact. It requires space, and I had finally given us both that. On the anniversary of the night, they told me I was no longer relevant. I cooked a small dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate. Soup, bread, a glass of wine. I set the table carefully anyway. not out of loneliness, out of respect. I ate slowly, noticing how different the silence felt now. It was not emptiness, it was presence. I was no longer bracing for impact, no longer rehearsing explanations that would never be heard. I was simply there. Later that evening, I took out the old notebooks, the ones filled with dates, numbers, betrayals. I read a few pages, then closed them. I did not burn them. I did not need to. They no longer held power. People ask what revenge looks like when it is done right. It does not look like ruin. It looks like peace that no one can take credit for. It looks like boundaries that do not require explanation. It looks like waking up without resentment and going to bed without regret. I am not naive enough to believe pain disappears completely. It changes shape. It becomes memory instead of wound. And memory, when placed correctly, becomes instruction. I still love my son. I love him without illusion now. I no longer confuse love with sacrifice. That distinction saved my life. If you are listening to this, and something in you feels seen, unsettled, awakened, let me say this clearly. If they excluded you, it was not because you were weak. If they betrayed you, it was not because you deserved it. If they rewrote your role, it was because you were no longer convenient. An inconvenience, when paired with clarity, is power. Revenge is not about destroying those who hurt you. It is about refusing to disappear for their comfort. It is about stepping out of the story they wrote for you and choosing your own ending, even if it is quieter, smaller, and far more honest. I am no longer the woman waiting to be invited back. I am the woman who left and never looked over her shoulder again. If this story resonated with you, if you have lived a version of this silence or are standing at the edge of your own reckoning, let your voice be heard. Like this story, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about justice awakening and choosing yourself, no matter your age.